Hey, everybody. Thank you all for dialing in. This is Barry, co-founder and CEO of Ivy, calling in from New York City. I'm incredibly excited for this conversation, and I'm glad that you've all joined us today. We have with us an incredible thinker, um, Patrick Deneen, who has written a work called Why Liberalism Failed. And we believe that this conversation will be an incredible opportunity for us to better understand both the history and the future of global politics and where we're going. So without further ado, Patrick, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
So we had the pleasure of hosting you in Chicago and had the opportunity to have this great conversation with our members there. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to share your thoughts with our member base across the country. To get us started, I think what would be really great is to hear from you why you chose to write this particular book, what prompted you, and why do you believe this topic is very important?
Right. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you, I guess, virtually. I really enjoyed the conversation I had with your members in Chicago. Um, I, I wrote this book not necessarily to speak to, I think, the burning issues that are on the forefront of most of our minds when we think about contemporary politics. This was really the main ideas of the book were gestated over at least a decade before the sort of recent cataclysms. So it really wasn't uh, intended to address contemporary crises. And it, to the extent it has addressed those crises, it's really because events have caught up with my diagnosis, I suppose. My main concern was what I saw was a kind of a complacency on the part of many contemporary, I guess, political actors and thinkers who had concluded that sort of the problem of politics, we could say the difficulty of establishing the best way for human beings to organize their society, which, as it turns out, is not as easy to solve as even Fermat's theorem or some of the most intractable problems of mathematics and physics. It turns out that this problem that has been with us since at least as long as human beings have begun to think about these issues. It was believed around 1989, I think represented by someone like Francis Fukuyama in his seminal essay, The End of History, that we had finally settled the question of how to organize our society, and that solution was the liberal political form. And I mean by this not conservative or left liberal. I mean liberalism in the kind of philosophical sense, a philosophy based upon individual rights, upon the freedom of people to pursue their own ends and purposes in the context of a limited government, the political forms that really define the Western world, the United States, Britain, Western Europe. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of complacency that we had solved this problem when in fact it seemed just as likely, and in fact the argument of my book was that this political form was as likely to produce as many pathologies as it was to solve problems. And those pathologies I saw as accumulating the more we became fully liberal. So the book was really written as an effort to sort of say to those who are in the kind of thinking about these issues that we really need to think about the internal crises that liberalism itself would generate and potentially lead to its interestingly self-inflicted demise.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So we're all every day bombarded by news of like different political developments, both here in the United States and across the world. And I think what we have the opportunity to do here is to really go deeper and get this deeper historical perspective on where we got to. So you mentioned Fukuyama's End of History, which was obviously written after the end of the Cold War. But if you could please take us back, starting, really over since even like ancient Greece, what has been the general debate around how society should be organized when it comes to political formations? How did that crystallize in the early 20th century with the competing visions? And then what was that end of history that people were planning for, or people thought that we'd come to, just so that everybody gets that grounding before we shift our attention back to the present day and exactly what's going on now?
Sure. I guess the story to be told is that it's a story in two parts, I think, broadly speaking, and I'm going to be very broad brush here. But the first part of the story is, how do you move from a society of relatively cohesive human organization that has as its model the family? You could say even something as large as the Greek city-state, 10,000 people perhaps, still saw itself as defined by a strong sense of solidarity. People who were relatively homogenous saw themselves as cohesive in terms of their own common destinies. Those who are movie fans will remember the movie 300, maybe. And the Sparta was kind of the model of the Greek city-state in which you really submerged your individual self for the sake of the political unit. And that was really the aim and purpose of the first part of the story, was how do you move to larger and larger political units while maintaining that sense of solidarity. And interestingly, the argument was that you needed a proper sense of freedom to be able to do that. And freedom was understood as a kind of self-governance, the governance of both the individual self and the governance of the political community, in which one, in some ways, subsumed one's own self-interest for the sake of the greater political ends. And this is the kind of classical language of the common good. And so we can think, for example, of what a liberal arts education once represented, and it represented an education in what it was to be free. That is, to what it was to learn these arts of self-government, the virtues of self-government, the emphasis upon virtue as a kind of self-limitation and self-governance. The second part of the story is one in which you could say the theme changed a lot. And part of that theme changing was, how can we create political societies in which the individual can be liberated from the limitations upon self-expression, upon my sense of individuality? How can we create a political society that can be large and diverse and sprawling, in which I am no longer confined by some preconceived notion of who I am, how I fit, what I have to sacrifice for the sake of the common good. And this is really what I define as liberalism. It's not a left or right political definition. It's really the broader philosophical frame in which you begin to get nations like the United States, modern Britain, and then Western Europe. And in this view, the state kind of comes into existence for the sake of the individual, and that the individual's liberty is really paramount. The challenge that liberalism presents is, what holds then that unit together? What's the basis then of anything that we're to understand ourselves as commonly oriented to? And I think that's maybe the deepest challenge of liberal society today. Is there anything common in a society that increasingly defines itself by the independence and liberation of the individual?
Got it. So those three steps that you mentioned, so one was a group of people defining themselves as a state and kind of like incorporating their identity to this overall structure, but then the theme of individuals actually wanting that freedom, that liberalism from like defining their own selves and having that individual power, which leads to this challenge, as you just mentioned, of, well, then what keeps us together? What is the common goal? What do we give up for that individualism? So how has that debate kind of played out from, you mentioned Sparta, so from there throughout the ages, right? Medieval Europe to Enlightenment, and then the modern day, especially after the First and Second World Wars.
Well, I think in very practical terms, the way that it's played itself out is that the modern liberal nation state became increasingly, we can say, devoted to the idea of the liberation of the individual from these sets of definitions that would have previously have, in many ways, constrained my sense of individuality and personal freedom. And so I mean, think about it. Examples I like to give my students. Think about common names, for example, in the British tradition, names like Smith or Taylor or Weaver. Those all identified what you'd be doing for the rest of your life. They identified professions. Or I'm here at Notre Dame campus, and so every one of my students, or half my students' names start with the letter O, O'Callahan or O'Neill. Or the Fighting Irish. Think of what that name means. It means you're of the clan of Neil. Or if you're a Swede, you might be a Johansson or a Svensson. You were the son or the daughter of someone. In other words, that you go from a world in which your identity is in many ways defined by who you're from, where you're from, what you will be doing with your lives, to one in which we're increasingly defined by the world and the life that we make for ourselves. And this is of course a great liberty. This is a great liberation, not to be defined by who you're from, where you're from, what it is you're destined to do. But it's also something that creates great anxiety. I teach at an elite school, and I see it all the time. My students I'm sure many of your members went through this too, as members of the Ivy League, perhaps, where even as you seem to be grasping the brass ring, you're filled with the anxiety of, am I making the right choices? Am I joining the right clubs? Am I building the right kind of resume to build a successful life? So a liberal world is one in which we are increasingly liberated from aspects, relationships that once would have defined who we are. And you could say the modern state grows in power and grows in its extent and expanse, not in spite of individualism. And this has been the long-term story, especially among conservatives, that there's an antipathy between individualism and statism. But that liberal statism actually waxes, it increases to the extent that people become more and more free, because the more free you become, the more you're going to rely upon and need the state in some ways to backstop, to provide for you the kinds of stability and benefits and support that might once have been the requirement of a particular community or a family, a church, and so forth. So at the same time that you have the waxing of the state, the growing of the state, you also have the increase of the market as the other sphere in which we find liberation. We achieve a kind of liberation. The irony is that for at least the last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, we've had this great debate in American politics. Which of these mechanisms best achieve our liberation? Is it the state or is it the market? And this has been the great divide between the left and the right until about 3 years ago, when suddenly everything got scrambled. But this has been the great divide, and this was really what I argue in the book is the great divide between the parties of liberalism, but entirely within liberalism. It's an argument over means and really not ultimately ends. And I think the cataclysm of contemporary politics has been in many ways a reaction both against the perceived powerlessness of people in relationship to the state and the perceived powerlessness of people in response to what they see as an increasingly globalized and ungovernable economic order. So it's not the old, you're either on the side of the state or you're on the side of the market. It's something rather new in which the rebellion was against both of the main engines of liberalism.
Absolutely fascinating. So the incredible way in which this increased freedoms and liberalism actually ends up requiring people to have more support, because the less we're dependent on religious and family type institutions, then the only thing that's left is the state. It's curious though, because again, at the end of the Cold War, it seemed like the good guys won out. The system that allowed people to trade freely, to vote freely, choose their own leaders. These states, democracies, they don't fight each other. It seemed like this truly an evolution in global politics, where like Western liberal democracies seem to have this very stable system. And clearly still a majority of the economic might of the world is controlled by these Western democracies, although clearly there are some shifts. But there does seem to be that anxiety both at an individual level, as you mentioned, or people not knowing exactly what to do with all this freedom, but also this feeling that politically speaking, with rise of populism and so on, that there might be some internal huge conflicts here that might, doom these societies, even though there continue to be some of the most advanced societies in the world, most of the advanced societies in the world. So is it really so bad, or is it just growing pains? How do you see it? We are having political issues. We've always had them over all of human history. But is it just the fact that, liberal democracies are finding their feet on how to balance these contradictions? Or do you think there's some underlying irreconcilable factors at play here that are going to be impossible to overcome?
Well, I think there's a deep tension within, let's say, liberalism itself that's always been evident. I'll give you a very pertinent example today. I actually just attended a conference in Washington, D.C. It's been getting a lot of attention in the media. It was called the National Conservatism Conference. And it's now becoming very much a part of the conservative movement to embrace the language of nationalism as a kind of core commitment. And what I pointed out in that, I actually gave one of the lectures in one of the sessions. What I pointed out was that the language of nationalism and the project of nationalism was actually a progressive undertaking in the early 20th century. The great nationalists were figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and a figure like Herbert Croly, who founded the journal The New Republic. I mean, very pertinent title of that journal, The New Republic. This would be no longer a confederated or a more localist republic. It would be now a national republic. So the national project was really understood to be connected to this commitment to liberalism, right? If you wanted to be liberated from one's identity as a member, for example, of the state of Wisconsin or the state of Connecticut or the region of the Northeast or the region of the South, then one needed to have the capacity to liberate oneself geographically, right? As well as the broader opportunity to escape from local circumstances, the circumstances of your family, your background, the tradition, your religious tradition, and so forth. So the nation was seen as the vessel, right? The space in which one could live and achieve this freedom of self-definition. Right? We tend to forget that the nation wasn't this confining space at that time. It was an expansive space, right? And technology then was really, the telegraph and the railroad was the technology that allowed us now to get out of these more local places, these more particular places. So thinking back just a century, what we have to realize is that the nation was the progressive vehicle for the liberation of the individual. But I think what we can say is there's a kind of tension within liberalism, right? Which is that the nation is going to become itself too confining, right? Now we begin to see ourselves not merely as members of a nation, but as potentially as international peoples, as people who are not defined by the nation state. So liberalism was originally understood to be the project that would be realized within the confines of the nation state. But what's to limit the nation state? What's the definition? Or what's the limitation of the boundaries or borders of a nation state? And if it's just the idea of liberalism, if it's the precepts of the Declaration of Independence, then the borders are arbitrary, right? The borders can be extended, seemingly to the entire globe if the entire globe is liberal. So in the first instance, we can say that there comes to be a tension between the original vessel, political vessel, of liberalism and where it ends up. And at the same time, we can say that that tension or that trajectory is going to run square into the reality of how it is that a people can understand to be self-governing in something so large, so encompassing, so capacious as now the global community. And I certainly think that's what the citizens of the EU, of the European Union, have run into. That the larger the units have become, the more they have transcended the nation state as the political entity in which people define themselves and identify themselves. The more people began to feel that they no longer held the power to determine their own political future. And you saw a lot of people in this populist uprising complaining about policy being made in Brussels, seemingly without sufficient input for people on the ground in the various places throughout Europe. So I think within liberalism there's a deep tension that ultimately is going to give rise to the very kinds of reactions that I think we've seen in the political world today.
So let's dive a bit deeper into that. When you see how everything is playing out currently with recent elections, with recent shifts to everything from Brexit to populist governments being elected in multiple places, what do you think will be the logical conclusion of this? Is it a reversion to more like nationalism first type approach, or do you think that it's a temporary setback?
Well, I think in some ways there's this isn't simply it's not simply a right-left phenomenon. We should notice, right? Because at the same time you have this, what I think is largely seen as a right-wing populist reaction. You also have, certainly in the United States, a strongly empowered left-wing, the rise of now self-defined socialists on our national political scene. That certainly wasn't in evidence even 5 years ago. Nobody would define themselves as a socialist. That was, you may as well move to the Soviet Union at that point. So really, we're seeing on both the left and the right a strong impetus, it seems to me, to in some ways to respond to this logic within liberalism of extending the sphere of our self-identification to a global, increasingly cosmopolitan dimension in ways that are arguing for the necessity in some ways of a kind of sovereignty. I do think you still have the old divide where that sovereignty is expressed more in terms of a kind of state sovereignty in terms of, and a political sovereignty in terms of the political right, where it wants to establish that these are the political boundaries that define what it is and who we are. And it's interesting right now, the right is struggling, it should be recognized, intellectually at least, struggling to define, for example, what does it mean to define oneself as an American or Briton or an Italian and so forth. It's perhaps easier in Europe, obviously more challenging in the United States. But I think on the left, you're seeing also the desire to in some ways, somewhat contain the logic of globalization and to assert a kind of political sovereignty on the logic of globalization and argue that globalization is having these effects that are ending up damaging especially the economic prospects of a large swath of the population. I think this is a lot of energy behind Bernie Sanders, who's been critical of a lot of the free trade agreements, just as critical as Donald Trump in interesting ways. So I think you're seeing on both the political left and the political right a kind of reaction against what the left calls neoliberalism, what the right calls cosmopolitanism or globalization, in an effort to assert a kind of sovereignty that restrains some of these internal dynamics of liberalism moving toward a kind of borderless world, both in terms of the state and the market. And exactly how that's going to look going into the future is going to be really an interesting question mark. I think one interesting possibility, and I don't see it immediately happening, but a really interesting possibility is that you have a kind of realignment that aligns the kinds of arguments that someone like Elizabeth Warren is making with the kinds of arguments that someone like Tucker Carlson is making on Fox News, who regards Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two-Income Trap, as one of the best books written in the last 50 years. It's striking, who would have thought you'd get a critique of capitalism on Fox News in our lifetime. So one possibility is a kind of realignment where you get people who are much more interested in a kind of assertion of a certain kind of sovereignty over economic and political affairs against those who are going to be more globalist, neoliberal in outlook, which would make for a very different political alignment than we've had in the United States over the last 50 or 60 years.
Curious if you think that, at the very heart of, just like, going back to the Second World War where this played out in the most extreme way, there was some thought that, yes, you have different countries and so on, but there was the Western democracies that fought together. They freely elect their leaders, freely trade, in theory, not maybe entirely free, but these principles which imply that, yes, there are borders and, we vote for our own leaders, but we're going for this, a more unified approach to things, as opposed to, let's say, fascist or communist governments that, control the economies and like restrain their people a lot more. I'm just curious, like, what is that? Is there a hybrid version where like a country can really deeply believe in democracy and trade and an open society while still restricting its borders and flows of capital and people and so on? Like, can it be a hybrid kind of a solution, or will it go one way or another? And my second question, just to go with that, is, is the West maybe getting a bit myopic? Is it just like lost in its own kind of political back and forth, where we're not comparing it as much to, let's say, alternative models like the model that's currently being used in China, right? Where there is no pretension of democracy anyway, but there is free trade and it's working for the time being, it seems, to an extent. Although, historically we've seen, how governments can succeed for a time, but not later. So just curious, what you think of how it relates, both in terms of like, these bigger ideals of liberal democracies, as well as like competing systems that are providing alternatives.
Well, I mean, if I had that kind of a crystal ball, I could retire and I wouldn't have to grade papers anymore. It does seem to me that the tensions we're talking about, and let me stress one in particular. I think it actually came out in the last debate between the Democratic candidates, in which there was a question of whether or not healthcare should be provided free of charge to anyone living within the borders of the United States. And there was kind of there was a lot of misgivings about that, even from many sort of mainstream Democrats. And you even saw, interestingly, misgivings expressed by many Hispanics living in the United States to that sentiment. After World War II, and I think here especially about both the United States and Western Europe, let's recall what was happening. In part, there was a very strong sense of national solidarity in those countries. They were, certainly in the United States, there was a time of great patriotism, great sense of a national cohesion, right? Yuval Levin has written a book called The Fractured Republic, in which he writes that both the left and the right look back to the 1950s as a time of nostalgia. For the left, it's especially because it was a time of a great the building of a great social safety net. And it was also a time of great widespread prosperity for, not only the upper class in America, but for, the working class, who at time of strong unions and the securing of what we now think about as especially those benefits of healthcare, retirement policies, and so forth, that were largely created in and through the great corporations that dominated the American economic landscape at that time. And for the political right, it's, of course, some of that is also looked back to with fondness, but it's also looked back as a time of family values, of kind of patriotism, of mom, apple pie, and Chevrolet, and all those good things that people on both the left and right look back to fondly for various reasons and for differing reasons. But I think we need to understand that there was a kind of connection between those two things, that the sense of strong national solidarity was one of the things that allowed people to believe that anyone benefiting from national policies was a part of something bigger, right? It goes back to that discussion of the Greek city-state. Something as large and sprawling as the United States was still seen as sufficiently coherent that people were able to believe that their contributions to the social safety net were helping people like them. And the same thing was happening in Europe, right? The same thing was happening in Germany after World War II, the building of the German social safety net, what we think about as the Scandinavian miracle and the Scandinavian utopia. These are people who, again, feel the strong sense of social solidarity. A great question then we're going to face, it seems to me, as we move into a world in particular where those, it seems to me, who are most supportive of extending a more comprehensive social safety net. So in the United States, providing free tuition or essentially free tuition to college students, of extending healthcare, perhaps through a single payer system and so forth, are also wanting to do so at a time in which there's a kind of widespread support for the lessening or the decrease of a sense of national solidarity and a sense of commonality that has to go to a kind of deep level of common identification. That's never been tried before. And I think some of the stresses that we're seeing right now, and certainly some of the political reactions, especially from the populist side, are arising very much from a kind of rejection of the idea that sort of the idea of some kind of social solidarity can be extended infinitely and without any kind of a sort of sense of commonality.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So if we take those perspectives and now really apply it in a tangible way to the political environment here in the United States at the moment, and then to some extent also in Europe as well, what do you think will be the developments that are kind of on the horizon? Many people found the election of President Trump to be a surprise, but now, it's been a few years. There's been a lot of developments also around the world as it relates to all these changes. So I know you don't have the crystal ball, but if you had to guess, how do you think the US political system will evolve or react to these changes? And what do you think will be the outcome? And similarly, also, what do you think will happen in Europe?
Well, I suppose in many ways we can say what I see the Trump election, as many do, as obviously a kind of a remarkable outlier, obviously a surprise to most people, but in some senses not entirely surprising in that he was able to tap into what turned out to be a widespread sentiment that neither party was addressing. And if we can use the language of economics, it turned out that there was a market segment that wasn't being served by either of the providers of political goods. So what is always typically the case in certainly American politics, which is in some ways organized kind of around a market model, is you'll have people trying to take market share. Right now it seems to me that the Democratic Party is certainly struggling to understand and define how it's going to take market share. And the great interesting challenge is whether or not it will have the capacity to do that. I mean, I think Donald Trump has driven people, especially progressives, so crazy. They've the reaction has been so strong and so powerful against him that the response against him may go so far to one side that they actually may end up not capturing the market share that I think they do need to capture, which is that kind of, that sort of Midwest sensibility that Donald Trump was able to tap into. And that's so crucial in American elections. But obviously, it's not just an American phenomenon. We're seeing this all over the world. And I think this phenomenon is perhaps more deeply reflective of the currents that I talk about in my book, which is especially one of the consequences of a liberal political society, which is as one is liberated, as freed from the kinds of connections that I was talking about earlier, it turns out that some people are going to do very well in those conditions. Some people are really going to thrive. And I think this is especially true of people who go to the kinds of universities that many of your members went to, that I've been privileged to teach at. I taught at Princeton, I've taught at Georgetown, and now at the University of Notre Dame. These kinds of people are well prepared for a world in many ways without bumpers and boundaries anymore, right? A kind of world in which, as Thomas Friedman calls it, a world that's flat, in which you make yourself. People from these kinds of institutions and backgrounds are equipped and prepared to thrive in an open, borderless, and flat world. And in fact, you could say it's made for them. It's their playground. It's people who don't have to live anywhere, who can live, don't have to live in any particular place, who can live everywhere and yet nowhere, who can move from city to city, place to place. We were talking earlier, you've lived in London, you've lived in, it was Edinburgh or Glasgow, you've lived in lots of different places, and I'm sure felt relatively comfortable in all those places, especially if they're big urban environments with lots of people of similar kinds of commitments. It turns out that this order does not do it, or people who don't do well in this order, it turns out people who for whatever reason, we might say, are need a stickier world, need a less flat world, need a world with boundaries and bumpers, who especially thrive in a world that's thicker, that's defined especially by thick associations, beginning with family life and community life, neighborhood, religion, and so forth. And if we look at the social science data, and this is one of the areas where social science is actually really very good, I would say, is showing that in every measure of stickiness, how we might define human community or human relationality, every measure, family, the likelihood of having children, the likelihood of having siblings, the likelihood of living in a community, the likelihood of strong associations, of a strong churches, strong sense of belonging. In every measurement of those kinds of factors, we're seeing absolute decimation, absolute declines. And it's not just in the United States, it's over across the entire world, especially in liberal societies. I think what we're likely to see is that as long as this is the case, we're going to see a strong reaction, especially from those people who are going to say, we need help. And I think that's part of what happened in the last election. It was like, none of you are listening to us, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, not the right, not the left. Donald Trump came in and first had to defeat the Republicans. So we have to remember that. He had to defeat 15 or 20 candidates who were all running as standard issue Republicans. And then he defeated a neoliberal candidate effectively in the form of Hillary Clinton. So a great question, it seems to me, is what political leaders or movements are going to, in many ways, not just capture those frustrations, but begin to legitimately address, I think, the sources of that great anxiety and social dissolution that we're seeing in a lot of those communities across the United States and across the world. And I think the political party or figure that figures that out is likely to have a great deal of success in forging a kind of future consensus in both the United States and in other countries as well.
I absolutely love how you frame that. So there's those of us who are lucky enough to thrive in this flat, borderless world with total flexibility, but then there are all those individuals who are not they don't have the same flexibility or the same ability to get the most out of a flat world like that. And what you called it is like, they want a bit more bumpers, a bit more boundaries for that definition. And I guess when you put it in the perspective of like, the marketplace for political ideas and someone capturing that middle ground, like, is there somebody who can both provide the growth and benefits associated with kind of like a border, like a world with less borders and more freedom to trade and move around, while at the same time providing other people who can't benefit from it as much with the right kinds of bumpers and make it balance. It seems like, and this is my last question before I move to some audience questions, is it seems like there's an unfortunate shift to the extreme. So people who are displeased, right, have voted one way to be heard. And then the reaction to that is now the loudest reaction is the most extremes on the other side. Whereas what might really be needed is actually somebody who's like very sensibly tying together the best of both worlds, like recognizing the need for open trade, open movement, and so on, while at the same time recognizing the need for the support systems that people need to thrive in an environment like that. Do you think it's possible for like a political figure or a movement to really capture that middle ground, to have that sensible kind of balancing of the both perspectives? Or are we just destined, at least for the foreseeable near future, to go from maybe one extreme to another until maybe people like get hungry for something more moderate and center again? What do you think?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. I think in many ways, the political divide today, certainly as it's developed in the United States, is going to make it difficult in some ways. I was just describing especially the difficulties of those who are less well off for various reasons: educational attainment, simply background, things that, for example, J.D. Vance described in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, that kind of world. And what we're seeing, especially in those communities, again, as I was saying earlier, is a kind of dissolution of family cohesion, of community cohesion, of the kinds of support networks that once would have made it possible for someone to thrive, even if they're not as well off as someone who's living in Greenwich, Connecticut. And this is something new in American history. We've always had economic division. There's always been the rich and the poor, but that hasn't translated into the complete monopolization of social capital for those who happen to be more wealthy. It's been the case in American history that regardless of what your income level happened to be, that one of the virtues, it seemed to me, of American society, certainly, I think, obviously with great exceptions when we think about race, but for the most part, one's class didn't define one's prospects to live a good and decent life, a sort of successful life, we could say, of raising a family, of having a certain kind of stability and expectation of a kind of decent and well-lived life. It seems to me that if you had, for example, a candidate who could put together arguments for wanting to provide, indeed thinking about using public policy for strengthening the kinds of, in various ways of thinking through, how do you strengthen family life in those kinds of places? How do you strengthen community life in those kinds of places? What are the levers that policy could be used at local levels, at more national levels, while combining that as well with the kinds of, let's say, expansion of the social safety net? It would seem to me that would be someone who would have a very powerful case for widespread support in American society. But here's the rub. I think today's progressives are not really eager to talk about how to strengthen families and local communities. I think you get a bit of that in Elizabeth Warren, but she tends to want to soft pedal that. In other words, if it sounds too traditionalist, if it sounds too family values, there's a suspicion that it sounds too old-fashioned today. And there remains a hesitancy on the part of the political right to talk about how expanding the social safety net, especially in a globalized economic order, is going to be a kind of requirement for people to live that kind of successful life. So it seems to me obvious, and if I had a candidate I could advise, it would be, kind of combine really what it seems to me is the most powerful message on both sides of the political aisle today. But I think for reasons that have to do less with the American people as a whole, but more with the political parties as as the energy in those parties is actually directed. It remains challenging to think about what I think you're asking, which is there a sort of reasonable middle that one can imagine arising from this? And yet I do think over time, people will find where that electoral support might lie, and it's likely that we'll see the development of a new middle. But I think it's going to take some time for this kind of, let's say, this period of deep unsettlement to work itself through and out of our system, and it's going to be, I think, a few election cycles before we're likely to see that.
Thank you so much. I can't help but think, I lived in the UK for 10 years, and there was a lot of this incredible political shifts where you had, on the one hand, post-World War II and the decline of, obviously British Empire and economic struggles, lots of strikes and so forth. And then somehow society, through economic growth and so on, was able to both, essentially what we learned even in high school there was like this whole idea that like most people ended up identifying themselves as middle class. Whereas there used to be like middle and working class type conflicts, the whole society seemed to have shifted into that, and there was broad popularity for the conservative government during Thatcher years and so on, based on those. Could it just be the case that, given the recent financial crisis and so forth, is it just the fact that maybe economically we just don't have the same kind of growth that we did in the 50s, 60s, and so forth, and that's what's causing for the inevitable inequality and the wealth disparity, but also just the baseline maybe not shifting fast enough? Because I think we've had decades where there's been great inequality, yet everybody was moving up. Whereas in the last maybe 10, 20 years, like that has become, that movement has been less, and that economic kind of, I guess, despair on many people is causing them to react and lash out,
Yeah.
rightfully so, for a different kind of system. Is it just the economics maybe like leading us behind and leading to
Yeah.
these political outcomes?
Right. Obviously, there's so many factors to consider. You're right that there was, maybe a little bit, somewhat through rose lenses, that people were considering themselves as part of the middle class. During a time of some expansion in the 1980s, there seemed to be, right, Ronald Reagan revived that line, "A rising tide raises all boats." But we also, I think, in retrospect, recognize that this was really the beginnings of the creation of a globalized economic system in which your boat could be rising, but you were living in a dinghy, and and a lot of people were beginning to live in yachts. And so it wasn't that everybody was living in a reasonably sized boat and everyone was navigating the currents with relative ease. It was really the nature of the boats themselves changed. It seems to me that a lot of the discontent today isn't that people feel that they're impoverished. I think it's fair to say that overall, certainly in the West, and even across the world, there's been a general rise in prosperity. So even people today who would be counted as relatively poor are far better off than someone who would be counted as poor during the Great Depression. But much of politics is often driven by, not by entirely material standards. It's driven by things like resentment, envy, the emotions, the passions. And when especially one sees many of one's countrymen living lives in which they seem no longer to be in any ways connected to their countrymen. And I think I live in the Midwest, and I think that's the perception of many people in the heartland to those on the coast, that there seem to be two different countries, one which is kind of more located in the center of the country, and one which is increasingly, people see themselves as less identifying with some kind of strictly American tradition. See themselves, this was kind of the critique recently of cosmopolitans or globalists, but that harkens back to an older critique by, for example, the intellectual historian Christopher Lasch, who wrote a remarkable book in the mid-90s called The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, in which he described this kind of growing divide between those who were highly successful and those who increasingly saw themselves as no longer, in some ways, in connection with those who were highly successful. So I think it's right, of course, to talk about these in strictly economic terms, but I also think we need to think about them in terms that are also very much a part of politics, right? Which get to the visceral sense of, the emotions, the sense of belonging, the sense of envy, resentment that's clearly on display in our contemporary politics. And it's difficult to know exactly how those kind of very deep passions are easily assuaged and addressed. But I think simply providing people statistics that everyone's doing better, or you're actually a member of the middle class, is not likely to work. I do think that it seems to me that you're seeing on both the political left and the political right today where the energy lies. If you think about it, really both of our political parties are trying to think of ways, how do you capture the middle class? And on the political left, it's especially proposals that are being described broadly as democratic socialist proposals. And interestingly, on the political right, you have these kind of working class movements, these populist movements that are capturing a lot of the support of the kind of working class. So I do think that we're likely to see some kind of change politics that's going to end up in some ways constraining let's just say the 80s rush to globalization, that neoliberal rush to globalization, that seemed to be of the view that as long as the whole pie was growing, everyone could consider themselves to be better off. And the question is going to be, how does one distribute a pie that, even if it's growing, has been badly misdistributed, or let's say distributed very unevenly. And it seems to me both parties are going to be addressing that question of the distribution of the pie, and perhaps there are different ways, but there may be some kind of a shared, again, the move to a kind of a middle, which we don't see yet today, I think, but may yet come to be in some years hence.
Got it, absolutely. And like you said, I mean, no matter what's happening economically, it's still critical, how people relate to each other, how much they feel like they're on the same boat and belong to something in common, and what makes them comfortable with the inequalities. And if nothing is holding that together, then clearly we're in a bit of a vacuum where um, where it's not clear actually how that all comes together. So I kind of interspersed some audience questions as we were going to what I asked. There's a couple of others here that I'd like to quickly get your thoughts on before in the last like 8 or so minutes remaining. So one question is as follows. Love the example you gave about how names have changed over time. I'm wondering if the way that the word community has expanded in meaning is related to how it's come to include non-traditional networks of people with common goals, identities, and so on. Would you agree there are some positives to this development? And then just my addition to that question is like, can those kinds of senses of community replace some of like what the state provided, the national narrative? Or do you think that while those are great, it still can't provide the kind of infrastructure that a state can?
Yeah, I'm trying to discern what might have lie underneath the question in some ways. What I suspect might lie underneath it is the kinds of sense of community, especially that we achieve and enjoy more through virtual media today, through social media and so forth. That when many people today think about their community, it's a kind of extended community beyond our particular space to people that you may not know face to face through the various social media platforms. There's also, and you could say that this is simply an extension of something that we see happening more broadly around the world, certainly in the United States today, which is that community increasingly is a kind of self-selected phenomenon. And this seems to me as one of the phenomenon, and maybe even a core phenomenon of liberalism as I described it, that one is not a member of a community simply as a matter of chance, or one seeks to reduce let's say, the arbitrariness of one's membership in a community to the extent that one lives in a more and more liberal society. So that if one thinks about the kinds of community one might have come from, if we grew up in Ohio or the East Coast or some other country, that as one becomes an adult in a liberal society, what one tends to do is find the kinds of communities that accord with my self-conception. And a shared sense of self-conception. That might begin, I think especially for many people, it begins with the selection of a college, for example. If you happen to be in a position to choose your college and get into the college that you want to get into, that will be one of the strongest senses of community that one will have after maybe the childhood neighborhood or street you grew up on. But let's face it, that's a community that's very much now kind of a creation, right? It's created by an admissions office. It's not merely chance, it's actually highly designed kind of community. And this is then the entree, it seems to me, into the kind of world in which you really select the members of one's community on the basis of maybe shared belief, shared lifestyle, that becomes a hallmark of liberal society. And I would say, this again, going back to somewhat older analyses, going back into the 80s and 90s, this was already evident, and it was a source of concern. And I think it should remain a source of concern, that to the extent that a liberal democracy is increasingly populated by people who self-select into very similar enclaves, very similar people with very similar worldviews and lifestyle choices and so forth, it means it makes it more and more difficult for us to speak across the kinds of divides that we're seeing in our world today. I would say those divides have always existed in many ways, but they've been exacerbated by our capacity to be really limit most of our encounters to those kinds of communities. So I think in many ways, one of the challenges, and I put this challenge to my students all the time, is it's not just to go find someone to talk to who's going to be different than yourself, but to consider the kind of community that you might live in that isn't simply composed of the people of the same worldview and the same lifestyle as a requirement of citizenship in a place like the United States, not just as a, to expand your worldview, but as a requirement to having a society in which we can be civil and civic with each other, to have the capacity to understand where someone from a different worldview is coming from, and even to some extent sympathize with someone from a different worldview. And if we can't achieve some degree of a community that's not simply self-selected, then I think some of these deep currents of division in our society are only likely to get worse as that form of self-selection becomes more perfect.
Thank you so much. And building on that related question, which I'm going to paraphrase, is you just mentioned universities, right? These are self-selecting communities, and they're supposed to be places of learning where you encounter different ideas and navigate and so forth. Yet there's also the perception that academia takes a certain stance towards things, and maybe actually, like even the term ivory tower, it's almost like potentially detached. What's your perspective on the role of academia, people who are constantly researching and formulating these ideas? How does the role of academia fit into this overall development in politics, and how do you think it could be better?
Right. It's something I think about and I write a lot about. I have a chapter in my book on liberal arts education as really as undergoing a crisis because of liberalism. I mentioned earlier that liberal arts was a kind of training in self-government, and if it ceases to be that, if it really becomes the springboard to autonomy and self-creation, then as we might expect, we're going to see a decline of interest in the liberal arts, and I think that's what we see in our universities today. There's a lot of discussion in certain corners of universities about the lack of diversity, the kind of monolithic worldview. Especially elite universities tend to be overwhelmingly more liberal, progressive in their outlook. I think I think it would be all well and good if we had more and distinct kinds of different political voices in the mix. I tend to be a bit more of a social conservative on most matters, and so I find myself maybe less at Notre Dame, but certainly in most academic circles to be a bit of an outlier. But my deeper concern is the kind of class divide that we see, especially it seems to me fostered and in many ways perpetuated by the kinds of institutions that I was mentioning earlier. These institutions are deeply committed to egalitarianism. You can't go, 5 minutes at elite institutions without hearing about the commitment to inclusion, diversity, egalitarianism, and so forth. And yet these institutions are more and more adept at identifying the kinds of people who are going to occupy the upper echelon and upper classes of our society. And there seems to be no cognitive dissonance that's happening in most of the people in these institutions. I think there should be a lot more fraught and anxious reflection on the ways in which these institutions have actually made our politics and our society much worse as a result of their kind of in many ways manufacturing of an elite class, and an elite class that's increasingly in many ways equipped with a belief that they are the most committed to equality. So I see the great problem of our institutions not necessarily ideological as such as it is a kind of a deep lack of self-awareness of their participation in what seems to me is one of the deeper divides in our polity today. And if these are the places where thinking is done, where reflection is undertaken, it seems to me this should be job one. This should be one of the things we should be thinking and reflecting on most, and in many ways changing our behavior if necessary. And I haven't seen it yet, but I'll keep sounding the alarm.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And here at Ivy, obviously we endeavor to provide that kind of an environment of learning and engaging with different ideas and individuals that we wouldn't otherwise meet or think about. So we certainly aspire to that as well as a community. I want to thank you for being incredibly generous with your time and being so thoughtful in your answers. And in the last minute before we wrap up, we'd love to ask you, what are the different ways in which our community can support you and your endeavors and your ideas, how they can get more involved with everything that you're publishing or talking about, thinking about, and if there's any final last word of advice you'd like to give to our audience today, we'd love to hear that as well.
Well, I'm often asked what is the sign of a successful education, and we have lots of ways that we're supposed to be engaged in assessments and testing and so forth. And I would say if you're still reading books, not because they're assigned, but because you want to read books, let's say 5 years after graduation and 10 years after graduation, then that's a successful education in my view. I mentioned a number of books here today, and I'm sure your audience knows lots of titles that they were thinking of maybe as I was speaking. I would just simply say, as a kind of civic duty, that those especially with the privilege of excellent educations and the let's say the gift of curiosity that has remained, to continue inquiring, to continue probing, maybe plumbing the depths of many of these issues, not lying at the surface where too often we see a lot of smoke, but not necessarily the deeper fires that burn underneath. So I would just say that as a college professor, that if you think you finished college when you graduated, then you did not get a good education. That I hope that a program like this is the opportunity to continue doing the thing that you should have done once you no longer have to worry about the tests and the grades and so forth.
Absolutely. Patrick, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And on behalf of the whole community as well, excited to have more conversations with you in the future, and wishing you the very best as you move over to London for a few months to start teaching there. And thank you to everybody else for dialing in. Looking forward to the next chat together. All the best.